Okay, welcome to throwing a 5-pound plate. 5 pounds is about the size of clay you're going to need to throw a plate this is a 14-inch diameter bat, and likely we'll get the plate to center to about 10 to 11 inches diameter, and then we'll throw the walls of the plate to extend to about 14 inches wet, which will then dry and shrink in drying and firing and be about the size of a dinner plate. So if you want to make a smaller salad plate, you could go about 3 pounds, 5 to 6 pounds for a dinner plate, 6 to 8, 10 pounds for a bigger serving plate. But the same kind of concept applies no matter what size plate you're throwing. And one thing about the weight of clay, or another thing about the weight of clay, is that you want to make sure you have enough to leave a certain amount of thickness at the bottom so that you can trim a foot into it when you need to. So start with a good wedged piece of clay. Get it started on the wheel. Okay, so got it on the wheel. I'm going to start the centering process by pushing it in the center. My wheel rotates freely so I can put one hand in the same place and push pressure down, rotate the wheel, press pressure, rotate the wheel a little bit, and get this ball of clay started in the center of the bat. A little bit of water here, making sure the clay is well attached to the bat, and then we'll start the process of centering. So just like when I center cylinders, I'm going to do a little bit of wheel wedging in the beginning, coning up to get this ball of clay fairly centered. And in the process now of pushing down, I'm going to continue just going further and further down. And this is where throwing a plate starts to be different from throwing a cylinder. So that last cone down that I did, I pushed, just continued pushing until it went to this wider diameter. And it's sort of on center on the edge. You can see a little bit of a wobble. And as I continue now to do the work of centering this, I'm going to introduce a little bit of an angle to the piece. So I'm doing sort of a mini cone up from this point out. So I'm going to push in a little bit, and then I'm going to push down from the top. And if I remove my left hand here, you can see my right hand is doing a lot of the work. The clay is touching from this finger all the way down to my palm here. And then I've got my other hand on top. And then when I'm pressing on it, I'm actually using all of the palm of my hand there. So a lot of my surface of my hand is touching the clay, which helps keep it a little more even as it spins around. Got a little bit that came off on my wrist here, so just want to pay attention to those things. When stuff like this comes off on your fingers, it usually means that you're taking off an irregularity in the surface by keeping your hand steady. It sort of scrapes off on you. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes you want to release a little bit of pressure maybe. Okay, so we'll go and do this again. I'm going to put my left hand on top. I'm left-handed. My wheel is spinning clockwise, so you might be doing things the opposite way if you're right-handed. But I'm going to put my left hand on top again, noticing that there's a large portion of my skin that's touching this plate as I push down. I'm just going to go back, push down a little bit more now. So I start by pushing at the top so that I kind of get that flatness going a little bit more. And then on the edge here, I'll change from the top to the edge using my thumb is underneath my left hand here, and I'm pushing down against that. So again, just trying to get as much of my skin as possible touching this clay. So now I'm going to push down a little bit there. So it's getting yet even a little bit wider. There is a slope. There's kind of a diameter that's this thickness right here, and then there's a slope down to the outer diameter where it's actually touching the bat. I can see the black color of the plastic coming through, but if I clean that up, you can see it a little bit better. So we're really starting to widen this, and again, the outside is not necessarily going to be on center through this process. So if you have some wobbling on the outside, that's okay. So I'm going back now, I press down on this, and you can see the shape that this is taking from the pressure that I'm putting on there. So again, if I remove my left hand, you can see that my right hand underneath, I have the entirety of my finger on the clay, and my left hand is pushing down I'm kind of pushing on my right finger, but also my hand is coming right in front of my right hand and pushing against it as well. So then I've created sort of a bowl, concave bowl in here, and this is about the time when I want to start thinking about the final thickness of the plate that I'm throwing. And I need to grab a needle tool. Back now with needle tool in hand. What we're going to do is stop when I feel like this is still a little on the thick side so that I can measure it and get an idea of just how much clay I have to work with. So pushing my needle tool directly into the clay until it touches the bat, and then bring my finger to the edge of the needle tool, touching the needle tool and the clay right there, and then holding my finger on the needle tool as I pull that out. Then I can use the thickness gauge between my fingernail here and the end of the needle tool. So I'm still over a half an inch, and half an inch is about the thickness that I'd like, because that way I can carve about a quarter of an inch foot in height foot into the bottom while still having about a quarter of an inch thick plate. Could be a little bit thinner, could be a little bit thicker. Consistency is most important. So knowing that I have a little bit of thickness there, now I'm opening the plate starting from the very center. And now this is where I go from pressing down like I've been doing up until this point to opening this. And I want to eventually bring this entire lump out to match the very outer diameter. And in that process, it's going to get even a little bit more wobbly. But I'm trying to fight that by spinning the wheel fairly quickly, starting my fingers in the middle. I've got a little bit of a bend to my fingers to give me some more strength so that I can press down in with my fingertips and then basically pull my hand back like a claw. So bending my fingers gives me a little bit more strength. If I keep them flat, it just is a little bit harder on my finger joints. So I'm going to bend them a little bit, and then I'm going to also use my left hand in front to reinforce my right hand finger so that I'm not relying on my muscles of my hand. So I'm kind of covering that over top, pressing down slightly, and looking at that little lump of clay that I'm pulling to the edge. Now I'm going to pull this one a little bit further yet. So the speed at which you can make that pull out is relative to the speed of the wheel. And what I'm seeing here is there's a dip down in the middle, there's a little high point right in the very middle, and then there's the dip out a little bit higher here, dipping again, highest points right here, dipping down to a little bit of point here, and then dipping down to the edge. So all of this eventually is going to be flattened out, and you want to make sure that you have enough thickness to play with all of these undulations in the surface. So the hardest thing that you can do to yourself is make the bottom too thin too quick. In an instance where I have this divot in the middle and it's the highest point's right about here, I can push. So now I'm using this portion of my right hand pointer finger is what's essentially making the grabbing onto the clay and pushing in. I have my left hand pointer finger right next to my right hand pointer finger to give it some more strength. And I do this a lot. I will have my hands in there doing a shape, and then my other hand helps with strength. So that happened there. So now I filled in that divot a little bit in the middle. There's a little high point in the middle there. And this is the stuff, every time you make a pass on this, you just need to sort of assess where you are with the plate. You're working towards getting it perfectly flat and consistent thickness all the way through. And every pull, you have the chance to fix the issues a little bit. But in between every pull from the inside out, or maybe it's a push from the outside in, to flatten this, you want to assess the plate and see where you need to put a little more pressure. As in right here where my high area is, I'm going to make sure that I apply a little bit of pressure to my fingers so they don't ride up that high mound, they kind of press into it. And continue out to the edge here again. So now I think it's about time that I push this diameter out a little bit wider. I want to take a look at what's going on there. There's an undercut there where I've pushed the top out a little bit, and I kind of want to even that stuff out. So what I'm going to do is push into this corner, and I'm going to pull out. Now I'm pulling out from the inside, but on the outside here I have my my left hand middle finger is supporting from the outside while I was pushing or pulling from the inside, and that's a way to even out the surface on the outside that was cutting in and coming back out. Having my finger here gives me the rigidity. Then as I pull my inside hand, my right hand, towards my left hand, I can starting to almost pinch the clay in between my fingers, and now I have the inside interior of the plate and these walls that I can now pull up and then flare out a little bit. But before I worry about the walls, I want to do a little bit more fussing with the inside to get this thickness correct. It came down quite a bit at the bottom, on the outside here. You can test this to see what looks like the low area. If I pull this out, looking at this, it's actually a little less than a half an inch. So I'm a little bit lower than I want to be there, so I want to make sure that that is my lowest point. But what I might be able to do is even this out and raise that thickness up a little bit. So what I can do is I'm putting some pressure on the inside, and I'm using very soft red clay. Soft clay is a good thing to throw plates with because you're pushing it a lot. It makes the drying time take a little bit longer, but from centering to widening a centered plate takes a bit of strength, so softer clay tends to work better for big, wide things like this. I'm going to go from the inside out as many times as I feel like I need to. It's using my sponge and my fingers in that case to pull this out. I also like to use the back of my my right thumb. I have a hitchhiker's thumb that can go backwards like that, and then I use my left-hand fingers to guide. This is a good way for me to get some control. I can feel the clay. I can tell that I'm a little bit more even as I go every time. Still have a high area in the middle. So now that that's looking pretty good, I can start playing with the rib a little bit. A big wooden rib like this gives me a notion when I start pressing on there. It's going to be hard to see in the video because it's pretty minimal, but the flat area of the rib, you can see where it takes away a little extra clay. Where there's a high area, there's very little clay removed there, which was the low area right there, and then starting to remove clay in that way. So using a big, long, flat rib like this can help you gauge where you are, but you might want to use a rubber rib, plastic rib. It's a little more flexible. And you want to practice getting the rib to the very center without gouging it out. And if you've done this at all before, you know what I'm talking about. That gouge you get, you want to make sure you're going to the very center, but if you go past the center line, then the clay is likely to cut into, especially a sharp plastic or metal rib. So that's looking pretty good, so I'm going to go back to the walls here now. And this first thing I'm doing is just kind of setting it up to do a pull. Now I can feel that down here where my fingers are gripping around it is thinner, then I have a thickness there. So there's not much pulling in the walls of a plate. But what I do want to do is even it out first. So I'm trying to take that thickness from above the thinner area, and I'm allowing the clay to come off in my fingers. There's a lot of movement in the side of the wall, and what I want to do is keep my fingers totally steady force the clay through my fingers so that that unevenness shows itself at the lip, and then I can trim the lip. So that was the first pull. Clean off my hands, my sponge, go back. Before I do my second pull, I'm going to kind of feel it and figure it out. So again, down here, right at the corner is my thin area, and then it's getting thicker. There's my thickest area, and then to the lip. So I'm just going to go one more pull. I'm going to allow it to flare out a little bit this time, but still not to the finished plate shape. That comes later because the clay is so wet that I want to keep the vertical direction of the wall for stability early in the process. And now you can see at the top I've got this little goober of clay that's come off. I've got a lot of that in my fingers. And if you see it while it spins, the lip is wobbling a little bit, because as I flatten and center of a disc to throw a plate, the outside is always going to have a little bit of wobble to it, and then in the process of throwing the walls, you move that wobbling up and expose it on the lip, so then I can trim the lip and get rid of that. So I'm just going to let this spin a few times before I cut into it, trimming the lip. I have the needle tool resting on my palm, gripped, touched by all 5 of my fingers, holding onto it really tight and figuring out just the right angle to cut in there, which for a left-hander spinning clockwise is at about 7 o'clock on the clock face. If you're right-handed, you're going to hold the needle tool with your right hand. It's going to be spinning the other way, and you'll cut over on this side. So I'm going to hold this really steady, got my finger riding on the inside. I'm just going to slowly cut through. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 rotations, and I could tell because of that little goober of clay on there. So it cut through 6 times as I was slowly pushing the needle through, cutting through. The wheel is spinning around. And that's the trick to trimming a lip successfully, is to allow it to spin 4 to 6 times before you cut the needle all the way through. If you press 2 with too much force and try to cut through in 1 or 2 or 3 rotations, you're going to deform the lip more. So every time you trim the lip, you want to make sure you compress it. So the first thing I'm going to do is compress the lip with a sponge, get that rounded shape in there, and now I can start to think about flaring out the lip of the plate. And this is an aesthetic choice. You can think about the function of the plate. You might be working with your own recipe in mind, something that you want to use this plate for. In general, plates will flare out at the lip a little bit, so I'm just going to do that for this demo video. I'm using my plastic rib, and I'm just pressing in with a little bit of pressure, trying to keep control of this clay. And at this point, we can sort of establish this. So what I like to do when I'm throwing plates is throw 1, and then keep the weight of clay the same, and throw 1 plate, and then throw 3 or 4 more to try to get a nice stack of 4 plates when it's all said and done. So throw 4 or 5, so you can have some cracking, you can have some things like that. So this could be flared out more, it could be flared out less. Think about if you're going to have a definition on the inside. When you're throwing a plate, you're throwing the inside, the flat bottom all the way across, you're throwing the walls, and then the second part is going to be, of course, trimming the foot in there. So I want to take some time to make sure I get the inside just right, and then we'll turn it over and trim it. So pushing with my fingers underneath a little bit to make this lump on the inside, or kind of hump that goes up and out. And since this is the very end, I can do these delicate movements and have the clay try to fight gravity by holding itself open like this, because it's just at the very end. So before we go to cut it off the wheel, I'm going to use my wood tool and just put it on the bat and bring it all the way to the edge where it's touching the clay. I know you can't see that in the video, but it's trimming some of that clay away. I removed a little bit of clay from the edge. And now what I can do is pull my wire very taut and cut the piece off. Alright, so now with the wire tool, holding onto the handles in my hands and pulling that as taut as possible, and then I'm going to use 1 finger on either hand to cut into just about the diameter on the bottom, and I want to pull this now as tight as possible and press down with these fingers on the bat as I started spinning. So it's touching the bat in the very back and pulling it very taut, pressing down with my fingers, and now just allowing it to rotate many, many times as I slowly pull the wire through. If I let go of that taut sensation, the wire is going to travel up in the middle. So I'm pulling as tight as possible, and I'm cutting maybe a little slower than I normally would, but it doesn't hurt to cut through slowly when you're rotating your wheel. And what that does is it slowly cuts through as it's rotating. It doesn't deform the plate. If you try to pull that wire through, it's definitely going to travel up in the middle, and it's going to stretch the clay on the bottom and give you a more uneven plate. So now that this is cut off the bat, what I will do is set this on the countertop to dry under the fan, and I will record the process of letting it dry, getting it off the bat, and trimming the back side. Do one more 5-pound plate. real time throwing. Get it on there. So with the initial, cone up. Twice. Still working on compressing, centering, flattening, widening. Bringing the clay as wide as I can while maintaining thickness of between a quarter and a half an inch thick all the way through so that I have enough clay to trim a foot in the bottom. Work on the inside, top, flattening it, and then I'll go to the outside. I'll using my thumb on the outside here to press down, just following this clay down from the outside until my thumb then touches the edge, and not worrying again about how perfectly centered it is because I can fix that with a trim later. Throwing a plate, I think, in a lot of ways is the most difficult thing to master. And it feels like every time I go at it, I am making sure I'm doing it as much as possible like I did the time before, but each piece of clay has different air bubbles, different stiffnesses, and you don't know until you just start compressing it what it's going to do. Alright, set up this first pull now. Thumb on the outside pressing down first to move some clay down, even it out a little bit, and now pressing my thumb in under here to establish a diameter. Pull on the wall. last pull in the wall here, and it's quite uneven. So I'm going to keep my fingers the same distance apart, so now the lip is bouncing a bit. Bring my needle tool in and just cut it flat. Sometimes that comes out smoother than others. Pressing the lip because I just trimmed it. And then I'll do a final flare. Just choosing which shape of the rib I'd like to use. Okay, feeling very thin in that corner. When I pushed the wood rib into it, I pushed in a little far. That's why you throw multiples. See if it survives trimming. Now there's like kind of an uneven angle right there. That is par for the course sometimes. Use my wood tool to cut underneath just to give a little bit of a gap where the wire tool can then cut under the plate. Now I'm not liking the look of this lip again, so I'm just going to use a sponge one more time. Try to get a nice round lip pressed in there. Okay, now to cut it, grab the wire, off the wire, pulling very taut, 2 fingers bringing it in to full taut, but keep my fingertips on the edge of the bat if possible. Spinning a little faster this time than last. Just bringing the wire underneath. Alright. There you go. There's another plate. And just trying to assess every time I throw a plate how flat it is across here. And then aesthetically making choices with the lips if you want it more up, more flared out. There's a number of things you can do. So now I need to let this dry. And when it's leather hard and can come off the board, the bat, which is sometimes depends on your studio practice, it could be a number of hours if it's open air, or a number of days if you wrap it up and come back to it in between.